if it's a true conversation, it is about relational connection, full stop, right? If it's not about relational connection, it is a survey. Yeah, it's an activity, right? It's not a conversation inherently by definition.
Welcome to the Disgruntled PM podcast, your weekly therapy session for the chaotic world of project management, transforming daily frustrations into real action. Welcome, everybody. I'm Trevor, the Disgruntled PM, joined today by my guest, Jake McKee. Now, today's episode is going to be a conversation about conversations. So, Jake, why don't you start off by introducing yourself to the audience?
Yeah, the short version is I am a conversation designer, let's say. I've been doing community work of some sort for 20-something years, helping companies and customers, community members get closer to each other, right? How do you build programs and understanding and all the parts and pieces that are required for a company to really understand their customers. They're really passionate customers, not just people buying from them, but people who are vocal advocates who are showing up in an online community or an offline meetup or those sorts of things, and saying, "Hey, I want more relationship with the company." And my job, starting way back when, built the adult fan community at Lego, and that relationship between company and customer. I have run the Apple Global Support community. I've helped the Southwest Airlines team build their community out. A number of other clients over the years doing all kinds of really cool stuff around this idea of connecting company and customer. But in recent memory, one thing that kept coming back to me, which is that fundamentally we're having conversations, right? We're building community programs, we're doing community strategies and that sort of thing, but fundamentally it breaks down to conversation. And in the last couple of years, I kept hearing from some of my clients, some of my friends, some of my industry colleagues that product teams were really having a pretty tangible struggle with what I'm calling secondhand insights, right? That product teams, engineering teams, development teams, innovation teams, they all kept kind of getting pushed into the corner, and being handed secondhand insights, right? The sales team comes and says, our customers are mad, they need this fix. The support team says, here's the top issues of the week. The executives are saying, here's what I'm interested in this year, right? And despite the best efforts to get product managers in particular out into the field, talking to customers more directly, and being told over and over again to be more customer centric, nobody was teaching them how to do it. And I realized that that's fundamentally the work that I've been doing for more than 20 years at this point, is helping companies understand how to talk to customers more directly and more relationally. And so that's what I've sort of evolved my consulting practice to do, is really have conversation and training around conversation.
Wait, you mean to tell me that the voice of the customer should actually include the customer?
Yeah, and a voice, an actual honest to God voice. Yeah.
Not filtered through everybody else's layers of what they think is important.
Right.
I mean, that's a baffling concept to start with right there. Just
absolutely. And as I often say, my core pitch is it's hard to build great products with secondhand insight.
Yeah. And I mean, let's start from the very beginning and the very basics of what makes a great conversation, because we have conversations every day in all facets of our life. And we say, oh, that was a great conversation when you leave sometimes, or that was a terrible one. But how do you frame, or how do you start off with designing a conversation to have a good one?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm going to talk about the framework that I use in just a second, but let me sort of set it up with kind of a higher level concept first. One of the things that causes these problems, especially, I'm going to use product manager, but it could be, innovation designer, it could be engineer, it could be anybody who's really in that position of having to make decisions about what product we should make, what the customers are dealing with, that sort of thing.
It could even be having a conversation at your kid's soccer game.
Yeah, it could be that too, right? It could be the conversations we have with our spouses. Any good conversation doesn't start with the outcome. Right. And this, I think, in business is so often missed because it seems so logical and on the surface, right? I'm going to go talk to customers because I have these challenges that I have to have solved, and therefore I need to get information. What was the repeating word there? I, right? It's
Yep.
not we. It's not an us together. And when we think, and I think I'm glad you brought up the, conversation with another parent at a soccer game. That's important because if we take those, we already do these sorts of skills in our larger lives beyond business. We just don't think about how to translate them into the business world. But fundamentally, especially these days, maybe if we go back 30 years, it was a different story. But today, there's such a thin line between me as a worker and me as a person outside of work, right? My work and my life are inextricably related to each other, right? Um, and because of that, everybody sort of expects different kinds of conversation. And I'd say even 30, 50, 100 years ago, you still had that sort of situation. You'd walk into the, the saloon to talk to the barkeeper. You'd still want to have a little bit of small talk up front. You wouldn't just immediately go and say, give me this and here, I want my bill immediately. There was some exchange, and that's about connection. It's about emotion. It's about seeing the other person as a person. And the story that I'll sort of set this up with is, I talked to a product manager friend of mine a while back, and he was saying, I've been listening to what you've been talking about for a while, and I thought, yeah, I'm going to go try that. I'm going to get a group of 5 of our engineers, and we're going to go sit across the table at one of our customers with 5 of their engineers, and ask them what they're interested in. And so we did that. We sat there for 2 hours. They gave us this huge list of things that they wanted to see changed. We disappeared for a month and did all those changes. Almost all of them we addressed. And we came back to them and they said, thanks. And that was it. And he called me up and he said, I thought there was going to be a lot more. I figured that there was going to be, all this extra work, all this extra connection and, relationship. And I thought they were going to be much happier and much more effusive about how appreciative they were. And I said, well, let's back up, right? Let's think about breaking this down. And this is part of that conversation design, right? Let's break this apart. Let's understand the first pillar of my conversation compass framework, conversation debt, right? Where did you come up short? And part of that debt was they didn't build a lot of relationship up front, right? They kind of went straight to just asking them questions. They sat 5 against 5 at a table. That's a lot of people at one table. And he literally had set his team on one side and their team on the other side.
You're building a confrontation rather than
Right. 100%.
fostering
And
relationships.
yeah, that's exactly right. And it's a separation, if not confrontation, which is really close to the separation. There was just that distance. They didn't talk a lot about how they were going to do what they were doing. They didn't talk afterwards about other things, right? That 2 hour window, and it shouldn't have been a 2 hour conversation. It should have been a 2 hour window, right? Where you sat down with them. Maybe you even had them do a factory tour for you first, just to show off what they were working on, ask them about themselves, really get some relational connection happening first. And then move to some of the larger issues, not just what do you want us to change? Okay, cool, we're making notes, but to say, walk me through your experience. Help me understand who you are as a person. How does that translate? Okay, now tell me about some of the customers. Give me some sense of who that is. Maybe even thinking about having one of their customers come in and sit down with them in that group for 15 minutes and just give them an insight into what they were doing, whether that's Zoom or in person, could have been either one, right? So that there's some sort of shared bond between both sides of that group so that there's one sort of fundamental outcome that you're trying to achieve, which is the better products on the behalf of my buddy.
You wanted to
And then of
build those
course,
you wanted to build those user stories first.
right, exactly. And understand the experiences, the emotions, the realities that go into that. And somebody might say, well, that's kind of jobs to be done. It absolutely is. Jobs to be done is its own framework. How do you actually go execute that is what I'm saying, right? That's what I bring to this. You've got a lot of great product managers out there doing a lot of great work on writing specs, understanding customers. Got a lot of market researchers out there doing a lot of great voice of the customer work. None of that stuff disappears, right? All that's important, but there's a piece that's always been missing that I think is fairly connecting between all those elements of that conversation. But it is first and foremost to understand that we are trying to create, when we create a conversation, whether it's at the soccer game or across the table with some engineers, we're trying to create an experience first and foremost, a positive experience. even more so, right? But an experience. We're not trying to get information. We're not trying to pull data, right? We're trying to create conversation so that when we leave and we're keeping them up to date over that month or two that we're doing all these really great changes for them, that they're building enthusiasm and excitement so that when we come back and say, here's what we've delivered, we've been building advocacy the whole time, right? We've been building enthusiasm and excitement and continuing to build that connection because it's never just one conversation. And that's, I think, where a lot of people fail in these moments is I have to know this data. Therefore I'm going to build these list of questions and then I'm going to go ask those list of questions and then I'm out. Right. I'm hoping we're building multi-year relationships that every single time we say, I want your input and here's what I'm going to do with it. And that was really great. I appreciate it. That we start to create much more of an in-depth connection between those two parties, much more shared success, much more advocacy, and that longer term relationship that allows them to come back to me as much as I'm going to them. And we both sort of feel like there's value in that connection over time.
Yeah, and like one thing I learned early on doing this show was before when I first started, I used to have my notes and they were these elaborate questions and I thought they would be great thought-provoking things and then
Right.
I remember there was one guest, I won't say who, but I went through my questions in the first 20 minutes and I'm sitting there trying to figure out, okay, well, how do we make this last longer?
Yeah.
And I've evolved to I have a sheet that I ask every guest to fill out. Well, actually, I make them fill it out. I don't have you on if you don't fill out the sheet for the information because there's a lot of behind the scenes stuff that I need to know for that.
Right.
And then I get this whole dump of information about the guest. And do you know what's in my show notes? Like what's up right now that I'm staring at above your head is bullet points, 2 to 3 words
Mhm.
of topics to talk about because it's a conversation. It's not an interrogation. It's not an interview. And I'd like your professional take on that a little bit too, because we spend so much time prepping for meetings, but we often forget that the meeting is two-way and not one way.
Yeah, and I don't again, none of the things that we do are irrelevant, right? Just because I'm coming in and saying, "Hey, let me help you," doesn't make everything else irrelevant. What it does is it starts to sharpen and create value in those things that we're doing. There is if you're going into a big meeting or you're going to go have a conversation with the customer, and this is the second pillar. We're doing good today. This is the second pillar is conversation tuning. How do we think about the points at which you need to be more curious? How do we think about the topics that absolutely have to be addressed as you say, bullet points, not as questions, content, paragraphs, because then that starts to get us into this mindset of just repetition, right? We're reading and then we're repeating and then we're moving to the next one. But the reality is a good conversation is driven by pure curiosity, right? And again, back to the soccer game metaphor. If I meet somebody, another parent out there, and they say something about their kid, and I say, "Oh, cool. Well, how long you guys been doing this?" And I go down the, "What do you do for a living? How
Yep.
old are your kids?" Then it gets real boring real fast. If I see that they're wearing a t-shirt, and this is where observation is as important as the curiosity itself, right? You got to have things to be curious about. What's the t-shirt they're wearing? And I don't know, it's a shirt from the Tommy Boy movie, right? Which was what I was wearing yesterday, right? The Callahan Auto.
And
I've
that's
had
what
people say, "Hey, what is that from Tommy Boy?" Yeah, and
yeah.
then we're often talking about something that's really interesting. And then if I switch to what do you do for a living, they're much more interested in telling me about the emotional side of what they do for a living. I'm an accountant. Okay, cool. That's what I would have gotten up front if I just said, what do you do for a living?" If I if I'm curious first, if I build some connection, if I find that observational response that I can turn into some genuine curiosity that then turns into some discussion. When I say, "Well, so what do you do for a living? What are you up to?" "Oh, I'm an accountant, but I work for, this group and I do these sorts of things. And, if you ever need some help, oh, that'd be cool. Yeah, actually, I've got this guy I should introduce you to. I think you guys get along." It turns into something much different. And the outcome at the end is similar. I've learned who he is. I've made some connection with him. I maybe even dug in on his business, whatever it might have been that I was thinking, maybe some of the best places to find new business leads are at the soccer game because I work local and I do something. Not necessarily me, but I've got a local business and local folks would want to come in, and so I want to promote that. But I don't want to seem like I'm just showing up at the soccer game with business cards to hand out. I'm genuinely trying to get them to come into my restaurant or hire me for landscaping or whatever it might be, right? I get there eventually, but this is where, we get so rushed and risk averse that we have to sort of buckle everything down. And I think this risk averse mindset of today's modern business culture gives us this idea that we have to create the perfect list of questions. I think the perfect list of questions is that bullet list you're talking about with points to be curious about if I get stuck, so that, part of the conversation tuning that I teach and then I set up activity and program for is about how do you find those moments of curiosity? If we were to go and do a field debrief on a conversation that was had before, I could point out, 10, 15 moments that I would have said, oh, that's interesting. Tell me more about that. That may not have anything to do with work, but that either allows that person to feel more comfortable with me talking about work or that leads directly into a path about their work, right? Finding out that an engineer really loves math. Oh, okay, cool. So you've got a more mathematical approach to how you're building your software, for instance. That may tell me a huge amount, but I wouldn't get there by saying, tell me about your workday,
Well,
right?
and to this point, it reminds me of a conversation I actually had a little while back. I was taking my daughter. I was dropping her off for a Girl Scouts camp one day. And if you have a daughter and you've dropped her off at Girl Scouts and you're the father, there's usually like one other dad there in the parking lot.
Right.
So I started talking to this dad and I noticed he was wearing a hat for a baseball team. And we were just talking, just the general killing time thing. And I mentioned something about his hat and he's like, "Oh, yeah, I work for that team." It's like, "Oh, what do you do for
Cool.
the team?" He's like, "Oh, I'm a scout." Okay, tell me more. I'm curious now. And my mind is going not towards I care about baseball because I really don't. But I
Right.
was thinking, okay, he's an in at a professional sports team and I have a podcast who I bring on interesting people. Okay, and then, I got him talking about what he does for a living, got him because, he loves baseball, so he obviously lives in that world and that's what he does. And I let him talk about it, let him talk about it. Limited knowledge, I was able to throw a few things out there, talk about how, oh yeah, I'm sure it's the glamorous life of traveling and living out of a suitcase in the lowest tier of hotel rooms in the most boring places humanly possible. He's like, yep. And then eventually I went in for hey, let me get your number. Would you mind connecting me with somebody in the front office that might be able to put me in contact with someone for the show?
Right.
And he was happy to do it because we had already had that conversation about more than just he's a scout. Oh, can you get me tickets? Oh, can you do this or can you do that? The general asks that people ask him.
Well, that moment of curiosity led to you asking some questions about his experience, right?
Yep.
And being able to relate it to yours, right? So, I think you were spot on to say, I bet that's a good breakdown, right? If we sort of pull that apart a little bit,
Mhm.
the idea of saying, oh, you're a fan. Oh, no, I actually work for it. Oh, you do scouting. Oh man, you didn't go straight to, oh, that's great. I want something from you.
Yep.
You went straight to a point of connection. Oh, that must mean that and I'm going to think about your experience, travel a ton and probably stay in some really terrible hotels along the way. I too have stayed in a lot of terrible hotels along the way. And all of a sudden you're talking about something that gives you a non-business, non-pushy persona or basis of credibility that can be then yielded turned into this connection that you want for your business later on. But by that point the person is so willing to help you because they think of you as a real person. Imagine that, right? They're thinking, oh, I like the cut of his jib. I like that he's doing something interesting, and yeah, I want to help him out. But we don't get there if we just jump straight to, oh, you work for a company, therefore you must know somebody that I can sell my services to. That immediately creates that block. And I think it's the same thing across an interview table too. Yeah.
Well, or I hate the term networking. I've said it publicly so many times. I despise that term. I call it relationship building. And you're on LinkedIn just like I am. How often do you see somebody post about, "Oh, I reached out to I didn't get the job or I didn't get the referral and I reached out to this person and they didn't want to help me."
I've
Well,
seen that. Yeah.
reaching out to the person when you need something from them is the last time you should be reaching out to them.
It is. And, with the one exception, I'll say that there are people that I probably haven't seen in person in 20 years.
Mhm.
15 years, maybe, I don't know, a long time, that I shared a conference experience with a decade ago, let's say, that I worked on a project with at a client 8 years ago, um, that I've kind of been watching their social media or their LinkedIn. I know a little bit about them. I've I've found myself responding to comments that they've left or posts that they've made or that sort of thing here and there, right? But I do have that relationship built up because we had an
Mhm.
experience that started our connection. So that when I do go back to him 8 years later and say, and I've been doing this, I've been sort of evolving my business in this year, 2026, and I am looking for some insight, some help. And so I have gone to some people I haven't really talked to much in a year or two and said, hey, man, I could use some feedback. I'm working on something. I'd like your opinion on it, right? Which is a much different thing than, hey, I'm doing something new. Can I talk to somebody at the front office about getting connected in to sell to them, right? That often leads to them either saying, yeah, I don't think we're a good fit, but I might know three people. Or they might
Mhm.
say, I know exactly the person, one of my colleagues you can talk to because I think they could also help you. Or they might be interested, or whatever else it might be. And I think that's a very broad footprint too. So there's that relational piece you're talking about that can last for years, even if it's not cultivated on a daily basis, it's still there. But also, it is figuring out how, what is your ultimate outcome that you're looking for, right? Because my outcome is to make sales through connection, but the way that I go about that could be 50 different ways. And if I've only got one in mind, if I walk into those conversations with only one in mind, and I'm thinking about a specific KPI, so to speak, instead of an overall impact, then I'm going to miss 14 different ways that I could get to that end outcome. Right. I think that's back to the curiosity, but also the openness, right? Thinking about this is the third piece, the conversation architecture, right? When I go into a program with a client or even just a regular conversation, I've got some structure in my head to how that's going to work, right? I'm not sort of just freewheeling it every single time I go into a new conversation because, hey, this is different than the one before. If I'm a business, no, it's really not. I need to have some structure to this. It may be a structure that allows me to be flexible, right? If you want to go out and do that networking relationship building type of thing, you still have to have an event to go to or a place to go to or a situation to be in to make those relational connections. That's a bit of architecture. If you're building a community, it has to have some level of program on how are you going to build your most powerful advocates, right? How are you going to go about that? That is a programmatic strategic approach, but how do you go into it with the flexibility to not be thinking about, I have to add X number of users. I have to get 10 business cards. I have to make this particular sale. And instead say, my impact is I need to be better known in the industry, or I need to have more people that are giving me feedback on this new concept. Um, I need some challenges in this new concept so that I understand why it's not hitting the way it needs to be. Those sorts of things, if that's the overall goal of that architecture, then like a house, there's 50 different contractors working on building a single house, right? And each one of them has to have that core blueprint that they're working off of. And I think this is the same thing we're talking about with conversations too.
Well, and one thing I want to touch on because I'm going to go out on a limb and assume I'm the only person that does this, like nobody else does this, but you walk into a meeting or you walk into a conversation and you've already played it out in your head 10 different ways of exactly how it's going to go down. You're like, I'm going to say this, they're going to go with that, I'm going to go here, and you go into these things, and I'll put in air quotes prepared, but you're not because you've only thought of it as the direction from you, correct?
Right. Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I don't know how this is happening this well today, but the fourth pillar of the five is amplification, right? How do you take what you know, what you're doing, and make sure that it is is amplified throughout the organization, right? That you are figuring out ways to really make those impacts important. One of my best examples of all time in doing this sort of thing was when I was at Lego. I was working with the adult fans, right? I was helping the company to understand that at that time.
Now let's hold on. Let's
Yeah,
clarify. The fans of Lego builders who are adults. We are not we are PG here.
Yes, yes. So, people who are 18 plus and use Lego as a creative medium. That's
Exactly.
a great clarification. Thank you. So, when I was there, the relationship between those adult fans and the company was, let's say, minimal, to put it polite. I was having to justify that we were putting all this energy and effort into maybe 1% of the buying audience, right? But that they had this outsized impact. A group of fans that put on a display in the middle of a shopping mall on a holiday weekend could bring in tens of thousands of people that many of them felt like, I got to go to Target right now and buy some new Lego sets, right? There was an outsized impact from their buying power. Not that they didn't have buying power per person, but generally speaking, it was hard to get the company to pay attention. By the way, they're at like 45% plus
Well,
now of their buying audience as
well,
adults with,
that Corvette behind me is a knockoff Lego one.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
But I mean, and to that point, I wanna kinda pull on this a little bit because we talked about voice of customer earlier, and you think about your ICP, ideal customer profile. When you're talking about Lego, because 'cause I've got kids, if I go out and buy them a set, I'm looking at price and what are they gonna do with it after I spend the hours building it. 90% of the time, it's taken apart, pieced out, and it's just scrap pieces. But if I'm buying something for me, I'm comfortable spending, well, I'm personally not, but but the fanatics are spending $200-300 buying these elaborate sets because I go to the service department where I get my car serviced at. All over the service department, there are elaborate Lego sets everywhere built for displays. And I always joke, I'm like, there's got to be 1,000, 1,500, there's got to be at least $1,000 to $2,000 worth of Lego stuff in this service department because all the adults built them and put them on display. And you wouldn't build those for your kids because if anyone's kids are like mine, as soon as I've spent hours building something, an hour later, it's already disassembled and sold off for parts.
Which I will say is a good thing because I go back to this idea that Lego is a creative medium. It's not a
Mhm.
it's not a toy for boys 7 to 12,
Yeah.
which is what it was. That was the thing that I was trying to overcome and trying to say to people that Lego is a creative medium. Fundamentally, it's a creative medium. Because if I can convince you of that, by the way, this is part of the amplification. How do we sort of find these little nuggets that then take all this data? You know, we have the debt. We realized where we were coming up short. So then we built an architecture to fix that. And then we tuned our conversational processes to make sure that we're getting really great conversations. And then what? Well, you have to take that insight, that learning back into the company and understand how to promote that. Well, one of the ways I was promoting that idea that the adults were as important to the mix as the kids, even though they built very differently. How do we do our part on the community team to overcome this hang up about price point, right?
Mhm.
Well, part of that was the amplification piece. How do we start to change the nature of how we talk about Lego as a company, as a product, as a brand, as an experience?
As a
Not
lifestyle,
just for as a lifestyle and not just for the adults, but also for the kids. Well, if I can convince my parents or the grandparents out there or educators or anybody else that Lego is a creative medium, then suddenly that price point is less concerning because I'm not buying a toy that's 3 times X what the next toy on the shelf is. I'm buying a creative medium. Right? I'm buying into a system of them learning to be creative, to build things, to experience this idea of creativity in a way that they wouldn't if they just bought an action figure off the shelf and that was it, right? All of a sudden the world kind of shifts in that sense. But I had to find that little Lego as a creative medium. It was a thing that I could share amongst my colleagues. It was a thing I could share out in the world. Part of the reason, when I joined the company, maybe in an office building, there'd be one person with Lego on their desk, and that was kind of the weird guy in the corner, playing with toys, right? And now, like you said, you walk into just about any business, and there's men, women, old, young, doesn't really matter, Corvettes, flowers, whatever the thing is. Lego really understood that there's all these different ways that we can approach this, and we can amplify our core message. Lego's a creative medium. Fundamentally, that's what it boils down to, and everybody can kind of get rallied around that. And, I was starting to say my favorite example of this amplification was that when I was trying to do this work and convince the company that these adult fans were, AFOLs is what we call them, adult fans of Lego, the AFOLs, that they were an important part of the business, even if the revenue wasn't in some place that it seemed like it was critically important to pay attention to them, that we had a future with them. There was runway for forever with adults that there wasn't with kids. Um, there was opportunities to sell them all kinds of interesting things instead of a more specific type of product, right? That it, to your point about lifestyle, that we could wrap lifestyle and other things beyond just the product itself around and create
Well,
revenue opportunities and connection opportunities that way. But nobody
and
wanted to pay
it's
attention.
and it's the idea that when you talk about the voice of the customer, it's what does the customer want? I you can hardly see it in my background, but or you can't see it, but I'm a huge Fast and Furious fan. So when I found the Fast and Furious cars, I'm like, sign me up.
Yeah.
But I think that also we need to pause here to remind the audience that I have a Patreon page where you can help support the show. It's $5 a month. You get access to the postmortem interviews, which are bonus conversations that I have with every guest. And Jake, you already signed up for that, whether you knew it or not.
Yeah. I'm excited. Let's do it.
And the topics that we're going to be talking about with Jake are going to be ways to tailor your conversation and some tips on steering it back on track when it goes off the rails. Because I think those are important conversations to have, but you got to be a subscriber to get that access. So let's pull it back to the idea of how do we actually have these conversations in a way that makes sense, that are actually beyond the surface level of things. Like you said earlier, you meet someone, we've got the canned 4 or 5 questions that we ask everyone,
Mm.
like, what do you do? Oh, where do you live? Oh, how old's your kid? How do we go beyond those in these conversations, whether it's professionally or personally?
Yeah, I would say, let me rephrase that. I don't think it's as much about going beyond it because that sort of assumes that we start with those things by default, which I think we do because we don't know what else to fill it in with. This is back to the idea that everybody keeps telling product teams and innovation teams to be more customer centric, but nobody teaches them how, right? So when they say be more customer centric, they think, oh, I'm going to go out and have some direct conversations with customers. I'm going to bring my list so I can de-risk any problems that might happen by having a really clear list of questions up front. The reality is it goes back to, I like to always put this, and often my training starts not with how do you do this for your product work, but how do you do it in your life? Right. Let's talk about meeting somebody at the soccer game and just trying to figure out how to have a conversation with them. Right. Breaking down the types of people that in our lives that we've come across or know personally already that are really good conversationalists, and what do they do really well. Right. Let's look at those sorts of things. My dad is one of those folks. My dad's one of those folks that can walk into a room and immediately people gravitate towards him. And I used to think that was some sort of inherent skill. It was just him. It was just sort of his energy or something. And maybe there's part of it to that. But as I got older, what I realized was that he had a genuine, actual interest in other people. Full stop. When he walked into a room, it wasn't that people automatically turned to him and just sort of floated over to him, right? It was that when he walked in, he had a great big smile on his face. He always gave a warm handshake to everybody. He made a point to go around and introduce himself, um, by his name, not just hello, but hi, I'm Chris. What's your name? And then he would sort of naturally find somebody in the room that I don't know. Sometimes it was somebody that was feeling a little left out. Sometimes it was just somebody who he hadn't seen in a while. But and all this was natural. There was, I'm sure he had experience that had added to this over time based on his job, his personality, his family of 6, right? Like, uh, I guess technically his family of 8 with his 2 parents, but
He just wanted out of the house.
yeah, maybe so. Yeah, he had to go find some people that would, give him some space to get out of that crazy house. Um, but the fundamental piece of what he always does is when he's talking to you, he is connected to you. He is asking you questions about you, not only the questions, but the answers, right? Oh man, last time I saw you, you were doing this thing. How did that turn out? Oh man, that is awesome. I can't, you got a promotion out of that? That's badass. So what does that mean for you? What are you doing now? Right. The whole time he's looking him directly in the eyes. The whole time his body language just translates to interest, right? I've seen him do this thing where he crosses his arms, and a lot of times when people cross their arms, it kind of gets them all, you know, sort of stiff, right? And we always hear from body language experts, don't do that. That's a sign that you're not interested or that you're separating. When in
You know what's
reality,
funny?
what
You know what's funny about that is in the military, there's a lot of militaryisms of statements that people say, and one of them is, "You're not in charge. Don't cross your arms." Like the idea is that you're allowed to cross your arms because you're in charge, and that's kind of a signal to authority and everything else
right?
in
Yeah,
the military, at least.
and that would be a tuning exercise to understand if you're talking to somebody in the military and you're not in charge, maybe you don't need to be crossing your arms. But the way that he did it was always very inviting, right?
Mhm.
He never did it until he doesn't do it until somebody says, "Oh yeah, well let me tell you about my job," and he goes, "Okay, cool." And he
He's
leans in. He
leaning
gets this.
in.
Yeah, he's leaning in. He's making sure that that's that sign. And again, I guarantee you, if I asked him, "Is this purposeful?" He'd probably say, "No, not at all." It's just sort of the natural skills that he's learned over time. But you can learn these skills, right?
Mhm.
I've learned it. I'm not that sort of natural connector type. That's, I've always been much more individualistic, but I've learned over the years how to do this because I look at him and I go, what is it about him that people sort of get attracted to? Oh, every time they start getting into detail, he like buckles down into it, right? Or he says, "Hey, let's sit down and have this conversation." There's just something that really signals to them, you're about to get deep and I'm here for it, right? You're getting
I
nerdy about the topic and I am totally in to hear what you're having to say.
You just highlighted something that or you mentioned something I don't even think you tried to that I wanted to highlight because in going back to the military about crossing your arms, in the military, when you cross your arms, you're usually crossing them leaning back, standing tall, authoritative.
Mhm.
So you're standoffish of, hey, I'm in charge. The way
Right,
you described crossing your arms is he crossed them to get closer to somebody, to get more not intimate, but more safely into their bubble to find out more about what they're doing.
right,
And if you ask a body language expert, I'm sure they would say that crossing your arms is bad, but it's also just like with everything else in context of how do you do something. If
right.
I ask you, so Jake, tell me about a conversation. What makes a great conversation? I can imagine the way that conversation will go. But since
Yeah,
I
I'll
started
probably
it off
break it
with,
down into some bulleted structures and
yeah,
talk about frameworks
it would be a
and
very boring conversation. But since I
yeah,
started off this with, so let's talk about this. Tell me about it with like, hey, I'm interested. We're having this great conversation right now. And
absolutely. And what's funny to me is that I have been doing work that has been new or different for literally my entire career, right? I came out into the workforce out of college just as the web was launching into something significant. And it was still extremely early days of the web being something thought about for business purposes.
I remember them.
Yeah. And in fact, the joke I always make is that I've been doing community work since that meant putting an email address on your website because I had so many clients at that time tell me, if we put an email address on, what happens if somebody sends us an email? Well,
Well,
what do you reply to them, you answer their question. I don't understand what the problem is, but they just didn't understand that it's sort of like the phone. If somebody calls, you pick it up and you answer their question, right? It was that early on.
electronic mail.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. The mail part, you already know how to do this, right? There's very few things in life that don't have some sort of existing parallel, right? That we can learn from. But over time, I lost my question, lost the question. We'll have to
Well,
edit that part out.
I'll pick it up for you.
Okay.
So, so I have a friend who they like to get into online arguments with people. They will say it's never planned, but it always happens that way. And I have kind of been coaching them a little bit about, hey, let's not go there. And then this morning, as I'm cruising LinkedIn like we always do every morning, because that's just what our lives are, I saw a particularly inflammatory post to me. It was somebody's thoughts and I disagreed vehemently with them. So I typed out a strongly worded comment telling them why they were wrong. And then I deleted it without hitting submit.
Sure.
Then I kept scrolling and I was like, that's still gnawing at me. So I went back, typed out the comment, typed out a different comment, deleted it again without submitting it, and moved on about my day because I got my piece out, but I didn't. It's kind of like that
Right.
write the letter without sending it kind of thing. And, you're talking a lot about conversations, but one of the things I want to highlight here is you can have a conversation that's one sided to get out whatever it is that you need to get out sometimes and not even involve the other person and move on with your life. And they never even know what happened.
It can be, yeah. That's you remind me of my mom. One of my mom's parenting axioms is uh, to think before you speak. Is it
Yep.
kind? Is it honest? Is it necessary? And so often, we hear this, especially these days, we hear this, I was just being honest. No, you're using the idea of honesty as a cover to be
Yep.
a jerk, right? And because it wasn't necessary. And, in your case, the question you were asking yourself, I'm assuming, was, is this necessary? Is it kind? Is it honest? It probably was. I'm sure that, there was, you had kindness and honesty in both those responses, but you kept coming back to, is it necessary? And so you skipped it, but you
Well,
allowed your thoughts to form as well.
and what I also went to was, is this going, does this benefit me? Is this a net benefit of making this comment, or is it going to be a net negative? Because it was a critical comment of the post.
Mhm.
And my first thought was, this person needs to hear what I've got to say because I don't agree with them. They're not smart. And then when I wrote it out, I was like, that's probably not going to go over well if some client sees it or some listener sees it. Makes me look, one person could say, I can destroy my reputation in one comment that took me years to build because the
Mhm.
wrong person sees it and has zero context of who I am or what I'm about. They just see one comment.
And I will add to that, though, one very important point, because I think you're absolutely right in all of that. What I don't want any listener to walk away with is thinking, oh, if it's critical, I shouldn't say it.
Exactly.
Because back to your point about relational activity, right? This is about relational connection. Fundamentally, any conversation should be, well, I don't even want to say should be. If it's a true conversation, it is about relational connection, full stop, right? If it's not about relational connection, it is a survey. Yeah, it's an activity, right? It's not a conversation inherently by definition. But when some of the best friendships I've had are the ones where my buddy will tell me, "Hey, don't be a jackass.
Yeah.
That's not cool." You know?
Yeah. And to that point, there are ways to be critical without sounding like a jerk to the outside of context. If it's
Yeah.
people that know me, I say what I want to them because they know that's Trevor. But if they're people that don't know me, one bad comment, and when we talk about conversations, framing it in every aspect, even what we do online are conversations. They're just
Mhm.
virtual one-sided conversations.
Absolutely.
And
Even marketing can be a conversation, and I think a lot of times what we see today is this really, dissociated connection between a company's marketing and their users, right?
Mhm.
Or their customers, whatever we wanna call them. I think that marketing is best when it is a conversation. It is a back and forth. It's, we're going to put something out that's really interesting, and then we're going to follow up with some other means of marketing that have a more conversational tone now that we've got this piece in place to talk about, right? I think Apple's Think Differently campaign from all those years ago was really amazing, not just because it was so wonderful. And I still to this day pull out the Think Different ad, the original Think Different
Mhm.
ad. Um, and watch it on, every 6 or 12 months, I'll watch it again for, I don't know how many years ago that was, but because it was really fascinating. It created something, an emotion in me, a feeling in me that wasn't just, "Ooh, cool. Now I've got to go buy an apple." Right? It was, I like the way that they think, and I wanna talk about that. They gave me something to share and talk about and feel, right? And then when that happened, then they could pivot into all these other things that would say, "Well, because you're feeling now you understand." This is back in the early days of the iMac, right? Where they
Mhm.
came out with the,
The
the
colored
bright
ones.
blue. Yeah,
Yeah.
the blue and the orange, and, those things were amazing, and they were unique, and if they had just come out and said, "Here's a new product," it might not have landed at all certainly not as well as it did, because it would have been so dramatically different that it wouldn't have made sense to our current day brain, right? And when they first said, "We want you to think differently," and now we're gonna come out with a product that backs that up, all of a sudden there's a connection that's being built between how you feel and what you want to buy. And that was an amazing, it was a conversation, right? That was a two-way interaction. It allowed me to do all these other things other than just decide yes or no, consume or not.
Well, I'll take that one step further, and I wanna every listener that's listening right now, I want you to think about this for a moment because I know I'm I know I do it. I promise you Jake probably does too, but you comment on somebody's YouTube video or their social media and you think, "Oh, they're so big, that's a huge account, whatever it is. I just threw the comment in there, they're probably never going to see it." And then they respond. How do you feel when you see that response from that official account saying, whatever the thanks for the input or just something to think, and then your mind goes into, I commented on an Apple video and Steve Jobs responded to it. It wasn't Steve, it was probably some intern, but you can go there and you can think about it that way. And once again, that's that conversation, that buy-in, that connection.
Well, and I'll even take it one step further. It's one thing for somebody like that to comment, so I do a lot of 3D printing, for instance, for my scale modeling hobby. And there's a lot of really, really talented folks out there, some
Yes,
really great
there are.
content creators that are doing some amazing things. And when I jump in and say, "Hey, in the video, this piece was not explained. Can you clarify that?" That response being, "Oh yeah, maybe I'll put that in the next episode." That's cool. But
Yeah,
them saying, "You know what? That's a really great point. I did miss that. Thanks for bringing that up. I'm going to put that in the next video." Oh my God, that's like a drug, right? I'm like, "Oh man, I am a lifelong subscriber now." I might even want to go, pay the extra money to officially subscribe to his, paid channel, or his Patreon, whatever it might be.
all right,
Because
I'm gonna nerd out here for a minute because I'm a
okay,
huge
go ahead.
hockey fan. Connor Hellebuck he backstopped Team USA in the Olympics
Mhm.
and really one of the best American goaltenders of right now. His dad is actually a YouTuber for 3D printing.
Oh, nice. That's cool.
I mean, it's funny because it's such a weird name. Everyone was saying something, and then one day, and then last year, the Connor Hellebuck won the Vezina Trophy, which is the best goalie in the NHL for the year.
Mhm.
And then all of a sudden, there were comments after comment telling his dad how everyone was so proud of his son.
Nice. That's
And
very cool.
the whole idea of this is, as a creator, it's not just the feedback I give you; it's the feedback you're giving me.
Right.
So thinking about that two-way street, it's not just social media is by its name, social.
Yeah, and yeah, I'll throw in the fifth pillar. I don't know how this is working so well, but I'm loving it. The last pillar is traction. How do you actually have some forward progress based on all these things that you've put in place, all the things you've done around conversation? What is the impact of that in the long term? And I think, what's interesting, you'll have to put the link to the
Yeah,
to that YouTube channel in the show notes, because I definitely want to check it out now, not just for the 3D printing, but I'm also really curious to see how much he's piggybacking, connecting,
he's
supporting
not.
his son in that
He's not at
process.
all. He never once mentions it.
So what's interesting about that is that I think there's choices in that, right? There's a choice somebody can make, and I think the default for us in the business world is risk abatement. Always, like that. Today's modern business culture is fundamentally, first and foremost, driven by risk abatement, right? We just want to reduce risk to zero at all possible. But
Good luck with that.
yeah, exactly. But that is the mindset, right? That nobody wants to be the guy that reset the no accidents since counter,
Mhm.
right? But fundamentally, what that does to us is it gets us in this really hesitant mindset to take advantage of some really amazing opportunities. And I don't know his case, but I would ask him, if I was talking to him, have you thought about making some of these moments for that connection? Because there is an opportunity there that's not pandering, it's not cheesy or chintzy, to say, if his son does a remarkably successful thing, then the next thing he 3D prints is something related to hockey. as a way to just sort of mention offhandedly, really proud of my son, right?
Well, and
He may have his own reasons. That's a whole different story. I'm just using this as an example to
yeah,
say there are times when we are so hesitant to do those sort of step outs because the risk abatement. Well, what happens if somebody thinks I'm pandering? What happens if somebody thinks I'm taking advantage? What happens if, I don't know. Did you have a conversation with some folks and say, hey, if I were to put something like this out, would it feel weird or not? Right.
well, I'll take that one step further again and say my favorite team is the Colorado Avalanche. One of the players, his dad, they do the behind the scenes tours and stuff. One of the players, his dad, he's like third generation menswear store in Canada. When they went to the city that he's from, he took the whole team to his dad's store and they did a whole behind the scenes of touring the store, about the store, all that stuff. And you see player after player walking out with the garment bag full of stuff. Players didn't have to buy stuff from him. They chose to for whatever their own reasons were, but it wasn't, once again, going back to motivation, it wasn't a force thing. It looked like it was a we want to thing. You're on mute.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure there's some background to how that came to be.
Yeah,
I'd like to hope that part of that story is that dad showed up to the games and they knew him.
he did.
And so
He did.
when they said, "Hey, can you guys come in and let's do this behind the scenes thing?" They were like, "Oh, I know that guy. I'd be happy to help out."
Yeah.
Instead of, again, risk abatement would have said, "I have to keep these two worlds separate. We have to put contracts in place that are specific about how this is going to be presented." Blah, on and on and on. And none of that leads to relational connection. None of that leads to a positive experience, right? It leads to risk avoidance, and we're avoiding risk. Nothing good comes from that if that's our primary driver.
Well, Jake, it has been fantastic talking to you. And now it's time for my personalized question for you.
Okay, I'm ready.
All right. So we've been talking about conversations. What is the worst conversation you've ever had and who was it with?
The worst conversation I've ever had. Oh man. I've had a lot of really dumb ones that still sort of haunt me to this day. I'm trying to think of one off the top of my head. I'll say I had a conversation. I'll use a more recent example. I don't know if it's the worst I've ever had. Probably not. But there was I had a new business lead come in to me just a couple weeks ago. And I got on the phone and misread his desires for that call. He was interested, he got a email that I'd sent out about kind of what I'm working on and had some interest in it. And turns out he was just kind of cataloging it, right, to figure out when and where he might be able to put my services into his product team at the right moment. What I read it as is an opportunity for a much bigger, grander conversation, one where I wanted to sort of do some pre-qualifying questions, right? And so I was trying to do what I sort of default to, which was have a conversation. He didn't want a conversation. His great conversation was me to come in and say, I'm going to establish some credibility. I'm going to share what I do and the outcome for it. And then you tell me where you want me to go next. Right. That was kind of his leader mentality.
Mhm.
Nothing wrong with that. Not a thing wrong with that, except I missed it. And I went into much more conversation than he was willing to have because my curiosity came pre-filled, I think. I did a bunch of research in advance to make sure I knew who I was talking to and what his company was working on. I got overly curious because I was like, I'm one of those guys that if you tell me about the thing that you're nerdy about, I'm going to nerd out with you. Right. And if it is an industrial chemical process, guess what? I'm going to be asking you questions about the industrial chemical process. Right. And I'm going to be genuinely interested because I can always find something interesting in everybody's nerd. Right. There's always something interesting. I love hockey. Dallas Stars are my team because I helped build the first website that they had and the second and third one as well before the NHL took over the sites. But, I got to see a lot of behind the scenes and became a huge Dallas Stars fan. Right. But fundamentally, I'm not a hockey guy. I enjoy the games. I enjoy going when I go. I liked that experience that I had, but fundamentally, I can always find something interesting. If you and I sat down and talked about hockey, I would be asking you all kinds of questions. There'd be all kinds of, we could go for
And
hours talking about it. And I'm still not a hockey guy, right? So I was really interested by that point in his product because I'd done some research. I'd done almost too much research at that point, and I lost him as a person instead of the work that I wanted to do and the things that I really wanted to learn out of that nerd curiosity. And
And
so I lost him as a person.
I want to highlight something there that I think you kind of hit on was is this fundamental in human nature is people like to talk about what they're into. So if you let them talk and you listen and listen, not hear them, but listen, and then have a couple of interesting follow-up questions that say, "Hey, I was paying attention." You're building that conversation just by default of actually listening to them and being curious.
Yeah, and but the problem was, yes, and the problem in that conversation for me was that I had defaulted to too much of that thinking around
Yeah.
people like to talk about themselves. So ask them lots of questions that they can then answer. He didn't want to answer a lot of questions, and that was perfectly fine. There was nothing wrong with that. I just missed it.
Well,
And,
that's intent.
yeah. And if I go back to the conversation compass here, the conversation debt piece, conversation architecture, tuning, amplification, traction. So in this case, I did sort of a debt analysis on my own after that call. Went through and said, okay, what just happened? I need to break this down. We typically know it as an after action review. It's that same kind of
Mhm.
thing. But the debt is, what did I not do? What did I do in that conversation? Where were the holes? Where were the gaps? Where were the missed opportunities even? Oh, you know what? There was this one moment where he said something that I kind of skipped past, but I should have paid more attention. Got it. I updated my architecture, right? So now, and the ongoing calls I've had since then with potential clients have been much better because I updated my conversation architecture to make sure that I was thinking about how much research to do, what kind of research to do, what kind of questions to ask up front. So I kind of changed my approach. The tuning piece, I was paying attention just as much in the next call and the call after that as I was in the assessment, the after action review part of that previous pour call, so that I could really figure out, okay, I tried this thing, it didn't work. I'm really thinking about trial, error, trial, error, trial, error, right? And then the amplification piece and the traction piece led to me sort of saying, okay, I'm going to really change the way I'm doing things. Here's how that's going to happen. Here's how it's going to play out. And those follow-on calls have been vastly better, right? Almost all of them in the last couple of weeks have had a scope of work go out, right? And that was because of that sort of conversational approach, conversation design approach that I came back to, so that I wasn't saying these generalities. Generality. If everybody wants to talk about themselves, ask them questions. Not always,
Yeah.
right? Yes, and right, they do, but what they want to talk about might be, you're a very smart leader. You're smart because you pay attention to tools like I'm presenting to you, and you want to know more about it so you can then go back on your own and categorize it into the right timing and the right spot and the right team members and the right usage, right? Should have read that up front.
So I want to hand the floor over to you, Jake. Let the audience know where they can find you, what you're up to, all that great stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to tell you three things. My website itself has a ton of resources, an introduction to the conversation compass itself and the 5 pillars. There's some assessment tools in there, some training tools in there, all kinds of content. I've really had fun building it out. But that's at jakemckee.com. I'm sure you'll put it in the show notes
Yep,
as well.
absolutely.
Um, on that site, I have started a podcast where I talk to really interesting professionals about conversation, how it impacts their business. That's the Conversation Lab podcast. It's on jakemckee.com/podcast. But I bring on folks that are a flight attendant, a political candidate, a psychiatrist, sorry, a psychologist. I have talked to a UX designer, all about this idea of how does conversation impact your business? What can we all learn from that? Who are you as a person that uses conversation in their work? And then the third piece is one that I'll share, the Conversation Lab event that I run once a month for 5 professionals, typically product, but also community support, CX, just people that really spend time connecting with customers in some form or fashion. And it's a small group, 2-hour virtual conversation that everybody who attends has talked to me for 30 minutes to understand that they are actually a match for the event. And that helps me to curate a really great group of 5 people. But because it's so small, it becomes a really, really great, deep, interesting conversation. And I even send a box of snacks out to everybody who attends just so we have something good to eat during the lunch hour. But and that's at jakemckee.com/conversation lab. All free, all fun.
So I got to end this with asking the expert, because I always say this show is a conversation. It is not an interview. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate this conversation that we've had today?
Well, I would say 9 because I always think that we could probably go back and break it down. But first and foremost, I feel like I've gotten to know you. I feel like if I called you up tomorrow and said, "Hey, I got something else I want to run past you," you'd be willing to have that conversation with me. I learned some things. I got some insight. I love this idea of the military and the arms folded. I'm going to use that later on. Um, and generally, I had fun in it. Right. That's I think an important part of this is that just because it's business oriented doesn't mean we can't have a lot of fun doing it. And if we can't have a conversation with somebody else smart that's doing similar things to what we're doing, and have a good time with it, we might be in the wrong business, right?
Wait, am I the smart one or are you the smart one?
And that's our show for today.
Well, and to your point, that's why I say I'm the fun PM, because
Yeah.
project management by profession, by trade, we are boring people. You've dealt with enough of them to know. And I try to be different.
Yeah.
So I think that's a great place for us to end. I want to thank the listeners and the Patreon subscribers for helping to keep the show going, tell a friend, all that fun stuff. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow. There is a new Instagram out there, so let's get that going. And most importantly, all of this is free, except for the Patreon. That does cost money, but the like, subscribe, the share it with your friends, tell people about it. That's how this grows. That's how I get better guests. That's how I get people like Jake to come on and want to talk to me, is because they know that there's people listening that they can share their message with. So I'll end like I always do. May all your deliverables be on time, your budget's in the black, and your scope not creeping. For Jake McKee, I'm still Trevor, and I'm still the disgruntled PM. Thanks for listening.